Okay, get this. Today we're diving into the life of a guy who, hung out with Russian royalty while trying to, prove that ghosts exist. Talk about an interesting life, right? This is Alexander Aksakov, a Russian nobleman from the 1800s. He was a diplomat and a really big name in spiritualism.
Yeah, that interesting life thing, you're not kidding. Imagine advising Tsar Alexander III during the day, and then bam, at night you're reading all about spirits talking to people. That's what makes this guy so
You know,
fascinating.
right? It's like two completely different worlds. So we're going to use a biography from a Brazilian spiritist website and a Wikipedia entry in Portuguese. And both of those say that Aksakov got into spirituality pretty young. Like, he learned Hebrew and Greek and Latin just so he could really understand old religious texts,
Yeah.
including writings by the mystic Emanuel Swedenborg.
Whoa, that's some serious dedication. It shows that Aksakov wasn't messing around, you know? He wanted to know the history, the philosophy behind it all. And Swedenborg, that guy claimed to have visited heaven and hell. Seems like that fits with where Aksakov's life went, right?
Totally, like the perfect start to a life obsessed with the spirit world. But what really got him into spiritualism was Andrew Jackson Davis, this American clairvoyant. He was super popular in the mid-1800s. Like, think of him as a rock star, but instead of music, it's like lectures about the afterlife.
Right, and his book, Revelations of Divine Nature, that seemed to really cement Aksakov's belief in a world beyond ours. And get this, he went to medical school. I mean, think about that. This guy was determined to use science to understand what people called superstition.
Yeah, wow, giving up a life of luxury for medical school, all to learn about spirits talking to us. Speaking of dedication, he also really got into the writings of Allan Kardec, who, as you know, is basically the father of Spiritism. He even translated Kardec's work into Russian, so he was basically introducing Spiritism to a whole new audience.
Hmm. Right, and it's important to understand what Spiritism is. It's not just any old belief in spirits. Kardec created like a whole system of beliefs, reincarnation, the ability to talk to spirits, all that. So when Aksakov translated those writings, he was doing more than just reading. He was shaping how the movement would grow in Russia.
Okay, but this guy wasn't content with just reading and translating. He wanted, solid proof of the spirit world. So he turned to science, right?
Yeah.
He founded this journal, Psychostudian, to encourage scientists to actually investigate the paranormal.
And this is where it gets really cool. Aksakov was working with some big names in science, like William Crookes, the guy who discovered thallium,
Yeah.
and Cesar Lombroso, this famous criminologist. They were documenting seances, investigating mediums, trying to find actual evidence of spirits doing stuff.
Wait, so you're telling me a Russian nobleman is working with scientists to prove that ghosts are real? It's like something out of a movie. It also shows how seriously some scientists were taking these claims back then.
Exactly. They weren't just some underground group. Aksakov was part of a movement that was pushing the boundaries of science. They were having seances in labs, using instruments to measure energy, and they were writing down everything in detail.
But it wasn't all easy, was it? Didn't he run into a problem with a commission he funded in Russia?
Ah, yeah, that Russian commission. They were supposed to investigate mediums, but they came back with some pretty skeptical conclusions. Can you imagine how frustrating that must have been? All that time, energy, money, and they basically said, nope, nothing to see here. So it led to a big debate, with Aksakov publishing a book called A Moment of Scientific Concern. He argued that they didn't use proper scientific methods.
So she wasn't afraid to disagree, even when it was his own project.
Yeah.
That shows how much he cared about doing science the right way.
You're right, he wasn't afraid of a challenge, and one of his biggest intellectual fights was with a German philosopher, Eduard von Hartmann. Hartmann said that what people experienced during seances wasn't spirits, but their own unconscious desires and anxieties bubbling up to the surface.
So, he was saying it was all in their heads, like those ghost hunting shows where they freak out about a noise, but it turns out to be the wind or something.
Exactly. And Hartmann wasn't just making this up. He was building on the work of other philosophers, like Schopenhauer, who believed that we're driven by irrational desires. It even kind of hints at some of the ideas Freud would explore later on.
Okay, so how did Aksakov respond to this, very unspiritual explanation? Did he just dismiss it as nonsense?
No way. Aksakov took Hartmann's ideas seriously. He wrote this whole book, Animism and Spiritism, where he carefully took apart Hartmann's arguments, and he presented a ton of evidence from his research and other people's work to support the idea that there really is a spiritual realm.
Sounds like he was a man on a mission. I'm definitely curious to hear more about his arguments and the evidence he presented, but I'm also wondering, Did everyone just accept these spirit communications? Weren't there any skeptics within spiritualism itself?
Oh, absolutely. And that brings us to one of the most interesting parts of Aksakov's story, his disagreement with the idea of reincarnation.
Hold on, he believed in spirits, but not reincarnation.
Hmm.
That's pretty surprising.
I know, right? It's what makes him so complex and interesting. He was a pioneer, but he wasn't afraid to challenge the movement he helped to create. And his doubts about reincarnation caused a lot of controversy.
Oh, I can't wait to hear more about that. This is definitely a deep dive I'm glad we're doing.
This whole reincarnation thing, it really shows how Aksakov thought about spiritualism.
Hmm.
He wasn't just following the crowd, you know? He questioned everything, even the stuff everyone else seemed to agree on.
Okay, so let's, unpack that a bit. Why was he so against reincarnation? Especially when it's, a core part of Kardec's Spiritism.
Well, Aksakov thought that Kardec had kind of forced it on everyone as this, unquestionable truth. Like, he pushed it on the movement instead of letting the evidence speak for itself. He was worried about the mediums. You know, they were already in a tough spot trying to prove themselves. And he thought they might feel pressure to support Kardec's views on reincarnation, even if their own experiences didn't really back it up.
So he was worried about, bias influencing the results. Which makes sense, given how much he cared about doing science the right way.
Right, exactly.
But was there something specific that made him start doubting reincarnation?
Yeah, there was this one incident that really got him thinking. Selina Jaffet, this well-known medium who worked with Kardec. She later started criticizing his views, especially on reincarnation. She went public with her doubts and basically got kicked out of the Spiritist community.
Wow, so she was, silenced for speaking out against what everyone else believed.
Pretty much. And Aksakov saw this as proof that Kardec was being dogmatic, like he was stifling any disagreement and just wanted everyone to follow along blindly. Aksakov even said that Kardec had, metaphorically speaking, buried Jaffet alive.
He didn't hold back, huh? Sounds like this got pretty heated, even within the spiritualist movement.
Oh yeah, it was all happening in their journals and publications, very public and very messy. But it wasn't just Aksakov against everyone else. Anna Blackwell, the woman who first translated Kardec into English, she defended him.
Interesting. So you've got Aksakov, the scientist, worried about bias and evidence.
Hmm.
And Blackwell, the translator, sticking up for Kardec.
Yeah.
Almost like two different ways of looking at the world clashing.
That's a good way to put it. Blackwell said that reincarnation wasn't some new idea that Kardec just came up with. It's been around for centuries in all sorts of philosophies and religions. She said Kardec was just building on those older ideas, not inventing something totally new.
It's interesting how this debate within spiritualism kind of mirrors bigger debates happening at the time about science and religion. You've got the people looking for proof and the people relying on faith and tradition.
It shows you how complicated the spiritualist movement was. You've got these pioneers like Aksakov trying to figure out this totally new territory, dealing with these huge questions about life, death, what it all means, and they're trying to balance scientific rigor with their own spiritual feelings.
And we shouldn't forget that even though Aksakov didn't believe in reincarnation, he still believed in the soul being immortal and that we could talk to spirits. He was still totally into exploring the spiritual world.
Absolutely. Disagreeing with Kardec didn't make his contributions less important. In fact, it shows how independent he was, how willing he was to challenge things, even when it made him unpopular.
So let's talk about those contributions. We've mentioned a couple of his books, but he wrote a lot, right? What would you say are some of his most important works?
Well, we've talked about animism and spiritism and a moment of scientific concern. Those were key to his debates with Hartmann and that Russian commission. But he wrote other stuff that really shows how much he knew and how dedicated he was to writing down all his research in detail.
What stands out to you? Is there one book that you think really sums up Aksakov's work?
One that I find really fascinating is A Case of Dematerialization. It's about this crazy thing he saw with a medium, Elizabeth Desperance, where an object just vanished into thin air like poof. Imagine all the notes he must have taken, the drawings he made, trying to capture this impossible event.
It shows you how committed he was to recording what he saw. Not just vague descriptions or personal interpretations. He wanted to be objective, even when dealing with spirits.
Exactly. And if you want to know how spirits might actually appear in our world, you should read his study on the materializations of human forms. He goes deep into the mechanics of it, trying to understand how something non-physical could become physical.
It's amazing that he was thinking about this over a century ago, long before modern parapsychology even existed. And he wasn't afraid to look back at history either, right?
No. He wrote Precursors of Spiritism from 250 years, which traces these ideas back centuries, showing that he wasn't just focused on the present. He wanted to understand the bigger picture, how these beliefs developed over time.
Sounds like a real scholar, someone who wanted to know why we even ask these questions, not just the answers themselves.
Exactly. And that's what makes his work so valuable. Even now, he was a pioneer, bridging science and spirituality, a man who dared to question everything and dedicated his life to exploring the unknown.
It's amazing how someone from the 1800s can still be relevant today. What do you think is the most important part of his legacy? Why should we in the 21st century still care about Alexander Aksakov?
I think it's his dedication to finding the truth. No matter what, no matter where it led him, he wasn't afraid to challenge conventional thinking, even his own beliefs, and he pursued knowledge with this relentless passion. That's something that never goes out of style, you know. It's valuable in any time period.
Yeah, it makes you think, right? This guy was a big deal in Russian society, a nobleman, a diplomat, advising the Tsar, and he's out there openly pursuing something like spirit communication.
Totally. It takes guts to do that. Especially back then, it shows how much he believed in it.
It makes you wonder, what would he think about parapsychology today? We've got universities studying near-death experiences, labs investigating psychic stuff, even quantum physicists looking into consciousness.
I've wondered that myself. I think you'd be excited to see how far it's come. All those questions he was wrestling with, they're being tackled with new technology and research now.
And remember, he was doing all this without the stuff we have now. Imagine what he could have done with brain imaging, electromagnetic sensors, even just the ability to record and analyze data digitally.
Right. It's crazy to think about. He was basically laying the foundation for a whole field that took off decades later. His detailed notes, his insistence on a scientific approach, it all paved the way for future researchers.
Like, even when you're exploring the fringes of knowledge, those fringes can become mainstream eventually. Who knows what other weird ideas might become accepted science someday?
Exactly. That's the cool thing about science. It's always changing, pushing boundaries, making us rethink what we know. And Aksakov, he embodied that spirit of exploration, that drive to keep learning, even when it meant going against the norm.
So after this deep dive into Aksakov's life and work, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from it?
I think it's the importance of approaching the unknown with an open mind, but also with a critical eye. Aksakov didn't just believe everything he saw or heard. He questioned, he analyzed, he looked for evidence. That balance between curiosity and skepticism, that's key for finding the truth. Whether it's science, spirituality, anything.
I like that, and I think that same open-minded approach should make our listeners want to learn more about Aksakov. Don't just take our word for it. Go read his work, his research, his arguments.
Yeah.
Who knows, you might end up questioning your own ideas about reality and consciousness.
I think he'd like that. Aksakov's story reminds us that searching for the truth is a journey. And sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most amazing discoveries.
Well said. So there you have it, folks, a glimpse into the life of Alexander Aksakov, a man who lived in the world of royalty but was also drawn to the spirit world, leaving behind a legacy that still inspires us today. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive, and we encourage you to keep exploring the fascinating world of spiritualism and all the mysteries it tries to unravel.